only be a local recording. And I understand I'm going to be sharing some maps here. Wait, let me help out. It's
That page is
Okay.
really only.
I have mine on.
here we go. Okay, Jake, I hear you. Okay, I'm the tech guy here too. So do you have some maps I'm going to be showing?
It's really only one map, but I've given you 12 web pages to show, which will just
Okay.
really.
And where am I going to find those 12 web pages?
So I emailed them to Neil.
Okay, Neil, your job is to forward that email to me.
When did you email them to me?
About 5 minutes ago. Well, 15 minutes ago.
I don't have. Wait, hold on.
Here, Jake, I'm going to put my email address in here. Okay, and by the way, the feedback we're getting is from Neil's computer. So that's Neil, don't worry, I muted you because it's horrible. Here we go. It sounds like a horror movie. Okay, here we go. Jake, look in the chat box and you'll find my email address. It might be easier to send it to me.
Okay, I think Neil has it though.
Okay, I'm going to keep an eye on my email. Here we go.
Oh, Neil is shaking his head.
No,
Yeah, don't know. Neil's a dinosaur.
Okay.
he's like my wife. She looks at a remote control and it stops working. So,
okay, I understand.
and she's yelling at me right now.
Okay, hold on.
That's because you're
Okay.
telling tales out of home.
That's right, but it's only the truth. I should sneeze.
Okay, can you know what? The chat box disappeared and I'm in the email, so I need your email. I'm sorry.
Okay, here we go. How do you want me to give you my email?
Just tell me.
Okay, here it is. R.A. Greenbaum. R is in the apple, A is in the green. Right. All right, like Rabbi Alex. R.A. Greenbaum, BAUM @gmail.com.
Okay.
All right. And I am known for being the the PowerPoint guy.
Okay, why is it not? Oh, maybe because Zoom, it's not letting me forward. It's not really letting me forward. It's
Don't give up.
I don't know why it's not letting me forward to you.
Neil's still trying to. R.A.
No, I got it. It's not because of you. It's because the email, and it may be because it can't email while Zoom is up on my phone. At RAGreenbaum @gmail.
Correct. R.A. Greenbaum with an A there. You right?
Okay, I got it.
Okay. Dun, 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 dun. Let's see. I haven't blocked you yet. Let's see. Tell you when I get it. Ah, there we go. Wait, Bree. Yeah. This looks good. Neil got it to me, by the way. And here we go. Good old Neil, picking on Neil. And here's the Jake one. I got both ears the exact same moment. And here are the 12 web pages you like. Okay, I can pull this off. When you name a web page, I will pull this out. Okay, I know how to do that.
I will give you a pause. I'll give you a little pause.
Okay, and I can split my screen so I can see it better. Okay, and actually, let's do it this way. Okay, I have a split screen. Now I can, pull it up. Okay, I am ready. And, oh, wait, let's see how many people are still signing on. Okay, here we go. It's 3 minutes late, which means we're early.
You're late.
We're late, but we're early for next time. Okay, and I like the board. Okay, now Neil, we can hear you better than you can hear us. What happens is when we talk, we get feedback. So I'm going to let you talk without me talking.
Hello, everybody. Bethel's going to war. Jake, I really appreciate you doing this series. I've really been interested in Israel's military history. From the little research I've done on my own, I think we're all going to learn a lot today. And Jake is the media director at the Israeli consulate in New York City. And I want to thank the consulate for adopting Bethel. You guys have really been great. And I understand you also do a lot of commentary on TV and radio in New York as well. And so I really appreciate you spending some time with us tonight. And I'm really looking forward to it. You should get rid of the New York shirt, though, and probably put a pirate one on. But we'll forgive you. We'll forgive you. So again, I appreciate the time, and I'm going to mute myself. And again, I appreciate everybody joining us. I think this is going to be a really interesting series. We're going to do this for the next today and the next 3 Mondays. So by then you'll be an expert on Israeli military history. We're chartering a plane and going to Israel via Venice to check it out. Alrighty, thanks very much. Here we go.
So hello, everyone. And by the way, we're the Israeli consulate, and we're obviously headquartered in New York. But this is a little trick I do. We have 5 states in our territory: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Delaware. And one of the little tricks I do is whenever I'm contacting someone in Pennsylvania, I always put the Pennsylvania first. So let's just say we're the Israeli consulate for the Pittsburgh general area and 4 other, 4 other places. But obviously Pittsburgh is really important to us. You should know that our consul general, Ambassador Asaf Zamir, his first official visit somewhere as our consul general was to Pittsburgh. So, and I've had a number of connections to Pittsburgh in my lifetime, a number of people from college and so forth. So I'm really happy to do this. One of the things that that is missed sometimes when you talk about a moment in history is people forget to set the lay of the land before that moment in history. So when we're talking about Israel's War of Independence and the state of Israel's history, obviously you talk about May 14th, 1948, which was the day of the Declaration of Independence, basically the statement where Ben Gurion is reading the paper. We'll show a picture of that later. Obviously, that's the beginning point. And that's not the beginning point of the history of the state of Israel. Obviously, it goes back thousands of years. But, for the modern history, we know that was during things that went on during the 30s and things that went on in the 20s and the beginning of an influx of more Jews. There always were Jews in the state, in what is now the state of Israel. There's always been a Jewish community, however small it was at certain times. But, we understand that in the 1870s, there started to be a larger influx of Jews returning to the land of Israel. So obviously, there's a lot of history that goes into it. But I want to talk about the immediate lay of the land. By the way, this is really important this is a shul group, by the way. I've always marveled at rabbis and other adult educators in synagogues who endeavor to teach the Mishnah or the Talmud and don't give the political and social lay of the land that was in effect at the time of these writings. So I don't want to make that mistake either. So I want to talk a little bit about the lay of the land, but I'm going to do a lot of this I hate to use that word. A lot of this talk is going to be hopefully things you've never heard of before, or things that you may have heard, but you didn't really know all the details about or important details about. And this is something that has really come to my mind and heart over the last 5 years when it comes to the situation in the Middle East. So the first thing I want to say is I'm sure all of you have heard the joke or the sarcastic comment, there'll never be peace in the Middle East, there'll never be peace between Arabs and Jews, yada, yada, yada. It's simply not funny for me because it's not true. And when I say it's not true, I'm not just talking about the last few years where we've had these incredible peace agreements like the Abraham Accords, and we're getting somewhere with Saudi Arabia. I don't think that we should hold our breath for this week being an official peace declaration between Saudi Arabia and Israel, but it's darn close. It's a hell of a working relationship. It's quite good compared to what we're used to, and I think it will happen one day and fairly recently. But I'm not just talking about that. There was peace between Arabs and Jews for many hundreds of years in the Middle East. Jews were not first-class citizens. They were not treated as well all the time, depending on where it was. But based on, I think, even an amateur's understanding of history, if you bothered to take a look at it really closely, frankly, and this is something we should all remember, it was better to be a Jew in the Arab world than a Jew in the Christian world until Napoleon. Napoleon comes around, and by the way, very unsung hero, incredible pro-Jewish person for his own practical reasons. And there's other problems with Napoleon, I understand. But until Napoleon starts to codify Jewish citizenship throughout most of Europe, it was kind of better to live in an Arab land. It really was. Then, of course, also Europe was moving into modernity regardless of their religious issues at that time also. So it starts becoming better overall for an entire continent. I'm not talking about individual countries. I'm not talking about individual cities where Jews had fantastic histories for most of the, maybe up until World War II. But I'm talking about as a continent overall. So that's one thing. And one of the things that may really surprise you is the lay of the land in what is now the state of Israel and its neighboring countries in the years and decades, I would say the 50 years leading up to the declaration of the state of Israel in 1948. So Rabbi, this is where I want to show the first picture. This is a picture of a book by Matthias Kunzel. It's an incredible book. Matthias Kunzel is a German scholar, grew up in Germany, grew up in all those places. And he wrote a fascinating book right after 9/11. It was called Jihad and Jew Hatred, Islamism, Nazism, and the Roots of 9/11. Long title. I'm happy to tell you, it's a very short book. You can absolutely finish it in a day. Next, the Shabbatot in the summer are really, really long. Good idea to start this on Friday night and then finish it on Saturday. It's a short book. And you might think it's a really, really depressing book because it talks about the direct Nazi influence into the Arab world that began really in the 1920s. And it's an important book because, again, it can be really depressing. You hear about all the interference and the money and the other encouragement that people like particularly Joseph Goebbels, but some other people in the Nazi party were giving, even before the Nazis took power in Germany, were already in partnership with a very small group in Egypt that was known as the Muslim Brotherhood, which I'm sure many of you know of. And of course, the Muslim Brotherhood is the forerunner of Al-Qaeda, the forerunner of ISIS, the forerunner of the Islamic jihadist terrorist philosophy is the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood got a huge boost from the Nazis. Now, again, really, really depressing, right? Especially since it became such a wildfire popular movement within Islam from that day on, with some pauses here and there. Here's the good news. It's not organic to Islam. Now, Islam doesn't consider Jews to be first-class citizens. There's a lot of problems, and there were pogroms in Arab lands, not like there were in Europe. So it wasn't a walk in the park. But Jews and Arabs for centuries not only got along pretty well, they had a very strong financial bond between the two of them. Arabs very early on respected the Jewish community's ability to be mobile economically, to be able to set up markets. And it got to a point at the turn of the century in Egypt, I'm talking about like the 1890s, going all the way until 1933, where the Jews were the dominant mercantile class in Cairo. Arabs would not shop in Arab stores. They would only go to the Jewish stores. King Farouk, who was very, very corrupt, but also pragmatic, had a lot of Jews in his cabinet, especially handling the economy. And King Farouk was in favor of a Jewish state. Why? Because the overwhelming movement within the Islamic world, even though this Muslim Brotherhood hatred of Jews and stuff was catching fire, the overall thought within the Arab world was, let's get rid of these darn British and French. And King Farouk and a lot of Arabs said, you know who can help us do that? These Jews. They've been living here for a long time. Some of them have been here for thousands of years. Some of them have been here for 60 years or whatever it is. And they will help us nationalize the Suez, get international financing for it from some of their banking connections, and they'll do really great work for us. So my point now, obviously, that philosophy did not win the day within the Arab world. But guess who played a big role in that not happening? The Nazis. All the way up until 1933, King Farouk had Jews in his cabinet. King Farouk was in favor of a Jewish state. And then the Nazis came and said, you know that Egyptian cotton that we're the number 2 buyers of in the world? We're not going to buy it anymore unless you get rid of the Jews in your government and you start backing the Muslim Brotherhood and you start opposing any further Jewish settlement in Palestine. And that was the huge turning point for the worse, not only for Egypt and not only for the for the Jews in the Middle East, but for the entire Middle East, for the entire Jewish-Muslim relationship started to take a bad turn at that time. But again, you see that 1933 is almost 100 years. It's no short time, but in the longer context of the Jewish-Arab relationship, it is a short time. And we're starting to see now a reset, in my opinion. And I don't think I have too many people who would argue with me. We're starting to see a reset now back to that time when financial considerations and other considerations, strategic considerations are now rekindling that bond between Arabs and Jews. Remember, Iranians are not Arabs. They're Muslims, but Persians are not Arabs. So when I say Arabs and Jews, I'm not talking about Iran. I'm talking about all the other Arab states. And there's hope there. We're seeing huge progress there. And to me, you can't understand the context of where we were in 1948 unless you understand the Nazi influence that had really deteriorated things. And it helps you to understand how in the world a small Jewish state that was starting to emerge. And now let's do a web page number 2, which is the map of the partition plan that was agreed to. Oh, you use the first one on the left. I'm sorry, on the top left. You want to click on that one so you can see a picture. And you see this tiny, there's really no other word for it. It's a ridiculously small Jewish state. The Jewish state is the stuff in blue in this map on the right. It looks like it's a lot of land, but it's still smaller, and it's certainly a smaller population than the densely populated, I guess, goldenrod Arab was supposed to be the Palestinian state, the Arab state. And not only that, but I mean, look at that situation on the westernmost part of the map, where the Jewish state is just squeezed into a ridiculous bottleneck, just begging for a supply chain problem. And we'll get to that in a second. It's totally untenable. And yet somehow they get 5 countries to get their Arab armies to go to mobilize in a war as soon as Ben Gurion declares the state of Israel to be an independent state on May 14th. And they're all gung-ho to fight against the state of Israel. That could not have been possible without the Nazi influence in the Middle East that had been there since the 1920s and had really taken a sharp turn to the more extreme level in 1933. And again, when I say influence, I'm not just talking about backroom deals, financing, things like that. There was a daily radio program. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was not one of the Arabs in the area who had any interest in Jewish settlement there. He was very power hungry and wanted to basically seal what the Arabs and the Jews had built together for himself and what the Jews had done. So the Grand Mufti was a guest of Adolf Hitler's throughout the entire war in Berlin. He must have stood out like a sore thumb. If you've seen pictures of the Grand Mufti, he wore Islamic dress, and he certainly didn't look like an Aryan, but he walked around Berlin a free and happy man throughout the war. And moreover, he used to drive about 20 miles outside of Berlin every day during the war to do an Arabic language radio program that was broadcast all over the Middle East, including Iran, again, even though it wasn't an Arab country. And one of his most ardent followers for that daily radio program, who listened to it every day very, very faithfully, was a man named Ruhollah Khomeini, who became the Ayatollah Khomeini. And so for anyone to think that the Nazi influence wasn't huge and it still doesn't reverberate today in the Middle East is just ignorant. There is still a huge Nazi influence in the Middle East. They're not dead yet there, sadly. I think it's on the wane. I think Iran is the last torch holder of Nazi ideology against all people not like them, but it's there and it's had a huge effect ever since. And that's what was, and so it really took that kind of rhetoric to get this kind of mobilization, because there wasn't a great love of Jews. There wasn't universal acceptance of a Jewish state, but to get a bunch of armies to march on Israel, this small state, they needed to have that kind of coaxing from that Nazi ideology that they had adopted and taken on as their own. Now, there's another factor as well, which is, you've all heard of the blood libel. When you say blood libel to a Jewish audience, everyone immediately remembers the many centuries of blood libel around Passover time, where they would say that the Jews had killed a Christian boy and used his blood to bake matzah. And of course, there were Jews who were attacked during Passover. In fact, in my family, because my family comes from Germany, my family's 8 generations in the United States, but we're still German Jews. And our tradition in our family for many generations going back to Germany is not to have anything red on the Passover table. Nothing red, no horseradish red, no red wine, nothing, because you didn't want red things in public view on Passover. That's how bad it was. But you know what? As bad as that blood libel is, there's a much worse blood libel against Jews that still exists, that is still one of the biggest motivators for war. And I think it was a huge motivator for people to join the armies in the fight against Israel in May of 1948. And that is the Al-Aqsa blood libel. If you live in an Arab country, and also Iran, you are very likely to be taught and told over and over again that Jews are not allowed at Al-Aqsa. They're not allowed to pray there, that the Jews are defiling it. The Jews are using it as a bathroom, whatever. This has been a blood libel that's been going on now for a very, very long time. Plus, they've added in some extra special, new and improved Al-Aqsa blood libel, where they talk about how there was never a Jewish temple there on the Temple Mount. It was never a Jewish site. I mean, they really lay it on thick. There are a lot of people in Arab lands who believe this, and it gets them really, really mad, as you might guess. And it's a big reason why terrorists today are motivated to attack Israel, because they believe that this is true. What's really, really sad about all of this is that the opposite couldn't be more the actual truth. It's Jews who can't have organized prayer on the Temple Mount, because the Israeli government very early on, really the same day that the Temple Mount was conquered and taken back over by the Israeli army in 1967, on that very same day, they realized, you know what? We better let the Arabs continue to have most of the religious authority over the Temple Mount. It's not worth risking the lives of Jews all over the world for this. And so if you have organized prayer of more than one or two people as a Jew on the Temple Mount, you will be arrested. So it's the other way around. The Jews have bent over backwards. The Israeli government has bent over backwards to make Al-Aqsa the dominant, really Muslim place there. And by the way, the place looks fantastic. Al-Aqsa is in much better shape than it was in 1948. They have really benefited from it. And what does Israel get for it? They get lies, including the Jordanian Waqf, which controls the religious side of the Temple Mount. Not only do they not thank Israel, but they do nothing to stop the lies about Al-Aqsa. So if you're wondering, gee, was it just good old-fashioned anti-Jewish anti-Semitism or some kind of Arab pan-nationalism that got all these normal guys to join these armies on May 14th and attack Israel? The answer is no. There's no way. Remember, the Arab countries were kind of new themselves. They were just out of their own colonial periods. They had plenty of corruption within their own countries. The idea that a bunch of Arab men would want to join the army to fight for whoever corrupt leader they happen to have at the time is not really something that was really gaining traction. But the Al-Aqsa blood libel and that Nazi influence was very, very strong. So that's the situation. That's where we are on May 14th, 1948, when this ridiculous partition plan is put into place, which puts the Jewish settlement, the new Jewish state, in a ridiculously untenable strategic situation, stretched completely thin along that western coast of the Mediterranean Sea, begging for a supply cutoff. And that's exactly so that's bad enough. Now let's talk about what kind of resources the Israelis had at the time going up against these 5 armies. Let's go to our third webpage picture here. And we should have, okay. This is the symbol, the official symbol of what we say in English, the Israel Defense Forces. Now, Israel Defense Forces, by the way, is a very good PR version. They don't want to say the word Israeli army. You'll notice that they always say defense forces. It's good PR. You don't want to say army, sounds really aggressive, so you say defense forces. And listen, I'm all for it, but let's do a literal translation of this logo here. It's 3 words: Tzahal, which means, Tzava, which means army, Haganah, which means defense, L'Israel, and for Israel. So army of defense for Israel, which I think is a fair translation, Israel Defense Forces, but it's a little bit better PR to say defense forces than army. But there's a reason why it's 3 words. It's not just because they wanted to do a 3-word acronym and make it into IDF. The reason is because what became what we say in Hebrew Tzahal, the Israeli Defense Forces, was a merger of 3 separate forces. The first was the Haganah, which literally means defense. It means defending something, and the Haganah was basically the Jewish army. It was basically a regular army. They had a command structure, they had officers, they had people who were assigned. Was it a lot like a guerrilla army? Yes, absolutely, but still, more like a regular army and all that kind of stuff. So that's important. The second was the Irgun, which was more of an underground group. And they acted like what a lot of people would say was a terrorist group. They were the ones who were responsible for blowing up the King David Hotel. And they were much more aggressive, but they merged with the Haganah to create the defense forces. And the last group was Lehi, which was really like, for our conversation purposes here, was really like the forerunner of the Mossad. But I would say they were more like field agents of the CIA. They were the ones who carried out assassinations. They were the ones who did that kind of work. So it was the reason why it's 3 words, and the reason why this logo that you're looking at has 3 words on it is because it was a merger of 3 different groups. So it's nice, 3 different groups, all with some kinds of experience. And there were people who were in the Haganah, especially, who had some excellent training. They were a group called the Palmach, who got really, really good training from the British Special Forces. The British also trained some Jordanian troops, so it's not like they were the only ones who had it. So it's nice that they had this little merger, but here's something that they didn't have. They didn't have a lot of resources. They did not have much to go with. So when we take a look at the 4th picture here, when we go to the picture of Ben Gurion, this famous picture that many of you have seen, where he's reading off, Israel's Declaration of Independence, and a lot of synagogues have a frame. My synagogue that has a framed picture of what he read that day, and you can visit, by the way, this hall in Tel Aviv. Like all government pictures, government buildings always look really, really big in pictures. It's a really small hall, and they've recreated the table and those flags and things behind them. You can go and see it yourself. So it's right in like the Dizengoff area in Tel Aviv. It's like you can walk to it and then go to a nice cafe and get some gelato. I recommend it all. For those of you who've never been to Israel, prepare to gain weight, but it's worth it. But you can go to this place. So here's Ben Gurion reading this off. They've got a ragtag army. They've got very few resources. They do not have the resources that they should have, and they've got all these armies attacking. But they do have some light arms, and they have some people who are somewhat experienced at fighting within that land. In other words, they're not fighting on foreign land. They really know their home territory. They knew how to use some of the nooks and crannies of Tel Aviv and some of the other cities to defend themselves. One of the people who they used to fight in those nooks and crannies was none other than Dr. Ruth Westheimer, who before her career as a sex therapist was a really, really good sniper for the Haganah and for the eventual, IDF, because she's like 4 foot nothing, and she had good eyesight, and they put her in little holes in the wall, and she was a good sniper. So, in other words, they had some skills, but they didn't have material. So here's what became the strategy based. So so this is the lay of the land. This is where we are right now. This is the reason why you had such hostility to the Jewish state, because of this culture and philosophy that had been growing within the Middle East, coming out of Egypt mostly, but also taking hold in places like Syria. And you also had a situation where the partition plan is begging to be attacked. It's just too easy to cut off the Jewish state. It's pretty. It looks like a walk in the park. You don't need to be a West Point graduate to see the untenability of what is the Jewish part of the partition plan. And you also have a situation where you have a ragtag army in Israel that has some things going for it, has some really good strategies, has some people who are familiar with the terrain. But as Ben Gurion is reading this paper, the armies are already marching on Israel, and this is what they're up against. So what's the biggest thing that they don't have? We're talking about a post-World War II world here. So no, I'm not talking about an atom bomb, but we're talking about a post-World War II world. And the biggest thing that the state of Israel doesn't have on May 14th is an air force. They really don't have any. They certainly don't have any jets, and they really don't have any planes. Now, they do have a small number of planes, Piper Cubs, the kinds of planes that you see at an airport, the private planes with propellers. I don't like those kinds of planes. I'm okay with going in a G6. If anyone in the synagogue has a private jet, I don't mean a plane, I'll be happy to take a ride on it. But the little prop planes with the big N for November, North America on them, that's kind of what Israel had. And they actually were a little bit helpful in the days leading, in the months really leading up to the war, because Israeli settlements, new settlements in the West Bank area just outside of Jerusalem, they were really good for supplying those settlements because they were small planes. They could dump supplies to them. They could supply them with weapons. They could supply them with food. And because they were very small settlements, it wasn't like flying over a dense city. It was really easy to find the target. Like you're flying over a desert or hills, nothing there. Oh, there's a couple of structures. We can drop a little food there. So that's what they were good for. They certainly weren't good for much of a military purpose. They weren't good for attacking anything. So what does Ben Gurion do? There's really a three-pronged strategy for the war that all you really need to do is kind of figure these things out. One is, I would say that, so Ben Gurion understands he needs to do 3 things. First is, I would call it moving mountains. he realized that he has to find a way to get an air force. He has to find a way to get more of a more weapons and more of a military infrastructure. The second is trickery. Trickery, I'll get into some of the highlights of Israeli trickery during the war. That's the second part of the strategy. And the third part is supply chain. You know, when I talk about supply chain, and I've talked about that in the history of Israel's history or wars in the past, I've always wondered, does anyone really know what I'm talking about? But sadly, because of what's going on in the United States right now and what we've experienced worldwide now, I know that when I say supply chain, I'm not talking over everyone's head. We all know how important that is, and we're all living it a little bit, although thank God we're not living it like in a life or death situation. I know we got crazy about the toilet paper during COVID, and now I can't find the rice that I really like to buy at the Trader Joe's. So I know I don't mean to compare us to people who are dealing with dire situations like that, but at least it helps us understand the context. So again, the three-pronged strategy to win the war is moving mountains, find some way to get the things they don't have, miracles, moving mountains, do what they have to do. Second is trickery, and the third is supply chain. And there were three different men who were basically the prime movers of each one of those strategies. So I'm going to start with the moving mountains, and the real person who did the moving mountains thing was Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion is the mountain mover. He's the one who says, here's how we're going to get X. And so there's a lot of examples of this, but let's just focus on one for our purposes tonight. And let's talk about the first thing, which is Ben-Gurion's efforts to get Israel some kind of an air force. And what he ends up doing is going after something that's going to look ugly. You're going to laugh. You're about to see the plane that really made up the Israeli Air Force for most of the War of Independence. This is picture number 5. And you're about to see something that really, and it's going to look bad. This is the picture on the top. I mean, it looks like a prop. I mean, I see a picture of that. It looks like it might be a movie prop, but not a real plane that would actually work. But this is the S-199 in the picture that we have here. They call it they have a name for it, like an Israeli name for it. But you know what this really was? This was a German Messerschmitt that the Czech government made a business after World War II of rebuilding bombed up, destroyed, crashed, not so good shape Messerschmitts from the Nazis, rebuilding them and then selling them. They were really strapped for cash and they were selling them. And Ben-Gurion had to find a way to get something, and Czechoslovakia was selling. And they were selling this piece of junk in 1948 for $180,000, which is outrageous price, because at the same time there was a similar plane that the United States military was using that was only $4,000. It was a much better plane. But if you may remember, this is also really important. This is one thing I left out when you understand the lay of the land. The United States had decided they were going to be officially neutral in this War of Independence, and they would not supply either side with humanitarian aid, with any kind of other aid, and certainly not weapons. So the United States is sitting this one out. When you hear about people saying, well, the Jews in America have always gotten the United States to supply them, there's times when the United States has come through real big time for Israel when it comes to supplies, especially in the Yom Kippur War. But when they needed it the most, when they had absolutely nothing, the United States sat it out. Now, I don't say this to indict the United States. I'm just saying this as a factual point that you should have at your fingertips the next time somebody says this. Yeah. If the United States wasn't supplying Israel with weapons of any kind, and they weren't in the War of Independence, then that's kind of wrong to say that, the United States was the reason why Israel exists. It's a big reason why it continues to thrive, and the friendship is the most important friendship we have. But remember, going all the way through the end of the Six-Day War, it wasn't until Yom Kippur War Israel didn't get weapons from the United States. Okay, so what does Ben-Gurion do? How does he move the mountain to get these $180,000 planes, which, by the way, were kind of a piece of junk? But he sets up a bunch of dummy corporations all over the world, because even though the United States was saying we're sitting it out, they also were very dedicated to trying to make sure there wasn't a big flow of arms going to either side. So it's possible that it could have been, if the Israeli government had done this directly, it's possible it could have the transfer could have been blocked by the United States or the Soviets or somebody. So he set up a bunch of dummy corporations to pay the checks for about 4 of these planes. These S-199 Messerschmitt, you know, they don't like to say Messerschmitt for obvious reasons, but this is this piece of junk that they got. Now, it was a piece of junk, but they got some good pilots. They got some good people who had experience. Some of them were Israelis, some of them were American Jews who were willing to train on this. 2 of them died in a crash immediately when they were trying to train on them in South America, but they got a few of them up to Israel just in the nick of time, because just a few days after the declaration of the State of Israel, a huge Egyptian convoy starts moving up north into Israel on its way to the major cities, and it's a massive convoy. Now, the Israelis blow up a bridge around the city of Ashdod to slow that convoy. Again, this is just a few days after the declaration of the war. So they got a respite, but the Egyptians only have about 2 days and they'll have that bridge repaired. So what are they going to do? So they decide to do something very, very daring, because the Egyptians have already bombed Tel Aviv a couple of times. It's clear they dominate the skies. But the Egyptians are figuring those bombing runs are one thing, but if we can get the convoy with all of our tanks and some of the other military vehicles into the cities, it'll all be over, and we won't have to worry about bombing Tel Aviv or Haifa or things like that. So the convoy's coming. The Israelis send 2 of these Messerschmitts onto that convoy on one of the nights while they're still waiting for this bridge to be destroyed. And the 2 pilots come away from that attack feeling like it was a complete failure. The guns jammed pretty quickly. They only got a couple of the vehicles, and they fly away thinking this didn't work. But it worked. The Egyptians suddenly see that there is some kind of Israeli Air Force. However, they don't really know how big it is. They didn't have the kind of radar technology that we have now, and they assumed that it was pretty big, and they start moving away from that bridge. They're scared. And like I said, I don't really think you can understand the wars against Israel going all the way through 1973 unless you understand that the motivation is not really that strong. They're believing, if they're fighting with any kind of conviction at all, it's because they're told it's going to be like a walk in the park like it was for the Nazis. The Jews are just going to surrender. And they're also believing, well, I'll care when we get to Jerusalem and I see my holy mosque being desecrated. But hanging out in a convoy in front of a bombed out bridge and a couple of planes, however bad they may have been, start shooting at us and bombing us, that they didn't sign up for. And so they start to move away. They don't go into complete retreat, but they do move away from that bridge, and they never moved again forward from that position. So that was a real mountain moving, just a magic act that not only those pilots pulled off, but Ben Gurion is responsible for this. Ben Gurion was really quite a great strategist when it came towards getting things that needed to be. He understood what needed to be acquired, and he found ways to get it, which is why even as late as the 1967 war, when he was out of power and was not the prime minister anymore, and Levi Eshkol was the prime minister, Ben Gurion made it very clear from his little farm, on a kibbutz, that he was willing to come back as prime minister during the war, because unlike a lot of our politicians today, he really was a hands-on planner, and it's a good thing that he was. So to me, this is the best example of the mountain moving. There were other examples, and there were many other examples that we could do 5 hours on. But to me, this is a huge turning point in the war, because not only does it stop that Egyptian column from advancing on that bridge and getting closer to the major cities, it basically created this image in the minds of the Arab armies that the Israelis had some way to fight back in the air, and they also knew where to how to use what they had, no matter how little they had. Now, this brings you into the trickery aspect of things, and I'm going to stay on the Air Force when I talk about trickery for a second. You also had those planes, the small planes that I was talking about before, doing things like dropping soda bottles out of their windows at night because they made a really loud sound when they exploded on the ground, and it made the Arab armies believe that the Israelis had bombers that could really do damage. They also did things like putting up movie screens in the middle of some of the desert areas and showing movies of tanks. And, in the middle of the night from far away, it kind of looked like they were real. Remember, these are people from some Arab countries, or maybe they didn't have too many movie theaters. They didn't really have that much experience. They certainly didn't have television yet. So it worked. These are the kinds of things that led to it. You can't pull off that trickery unless you have this attack with those Messerschmitts in the early days of the war. Without it, they might have already sort of thought, no, this is fake. But they saw this, and it led to the belief that the Jews had found some way to get some kind of an air force going. And so then they were able to pull off some of the other trickery. The key man behind trickery, the key man who really understood about taking advantage of things that were basically creating a misdirection, was Moshe Dayan. Moshe Dayan was really good at that. And I want to show now picture number 6. Because in my opinion, this is the best example of Israeli trickery during the war. This is something that, now, by the way, this is not a miniature. This is not like the movie Spinal Tap, where they had the wrong size Stonehenge. This is literally the size. I mean, if there were a man standing next to it, his head would be, I love how they put it next to a jungle gym in this picture. A slide. It's basically to give the idea of how big this mortar was. This is something called the Davidka mortar. And it was named Davidka after King David. It was literally, they realized they were up against Goliath. This is going to be our slingshot, like David had. And we're going to use this. And okay, so it looks really, really small. It is really small. But what did it have going for it? It was louder than anything. Think of it was just an incredibly loud mortar. To this day, we're still not really sure how much damage this little guy did. They used it a lot, though. It made such a loud sound that there were Arab armies who thought that the Jews had gotten a nuclear, an atom bomb. That's how loud it was. Really, really loud. I assume everyone who operated it lost their hearing, even if they were wearing earplugs. I can only imagine it was that bad. But it was a tremendous aspect of trickery for the Israeli forces. It really, really worked to create a belief that the Israelis had a huge, maybe like a Big Bertha, 88 millimeter, major artillery gun, which they didn't. So this to me is the best example. And the fact that it was named after David, King David, and the slingshot he as a little boy with Goliath, young man, whatever you want to say, is a really, really good example of what they were really doing in that war. So there's a lot of trickery. So now I want to get to the last part of Israeli strategy, which is really, really important, and for an American audience, I think quite crucial. Let's go to picture number 7. As we get to that third part, that supply chain aspect of the war, and you can click on the first pick, the top right. Yeah, there you go. You can pick on this. This is a man named Mickey Marcus. Now, Mickey Marcus was a West Point graduate from New York City. Grew up in New York City, Jewish man. And he reached the level of colonel during World War II. And he had a lot of important jobs in World War II. He was a really, really good administrator. And as silly as that sounds, when you understand the undertaking that World War II was, just D-Day alone, for example, someone who really knows how to get things to the place that they need to get to on time and get the equipment there was very, very, basically invaluable. And so Mickey Marcus was in demand. A lot of generals, famous generals in World War II, wanted Mickey Marcus and got Mickey Marcus on their staff. And this is the kind of work that he did. And he was still very valuable in the US military, still a full colonel. He's a full colonel in 1947, 1948, when Ben-Gurion visits the United States, visits the Jewish community. One of the things that Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir did was, for years, they toured the United States fundraising. I'm sure he came to your synagogue or your community. If your synagogue wasn't founded yet, I don't know, but he came everywhere. And so he was always doing things like this. And one of the things he was doing in 1947 was hoping to find some Jewish person with World War II experience who could be a general in the Israeli army. So one of the guys that he asks to do this job is Mickey Marcus. He sees him in basically an accidental meeting and says, Mickey, help me find someone who can be a general for us. And it becomes clear that Mickey can't find anyone, and he's the guy for the job. So Mickey Marcus becomes Israel's first real general. They gave him the title general, and the United States Army said to him, we're not going to punish you for doing whatever time you're going to do with the Israeli forces, but you need to change your name. So he changes his name and becomes Michael Stone. And he becomes Michael Stone, and he becomes the first general in the Israeli army. Now, what does he do in the Israeli army? He understands supply chain. He understands that map that we showed in the beginning with that ridiculous strip of land. And he understands that Jerusalem is likely to be cut off and sure enough, it is. On the day that the state of Israel is declared on May 14th, the Arab armies begin the siege of Jerusalem, and it's just a siege. It's not like my Trader Joe's. Nothing's coming in, nothing's coming out, and they need to figure out a way to fix this problem. And it's very obvious that they need to take care of this. And Mickey Marcus turns out to be the perfect man for the job, because this is a guy who's had all this kind of experience finding ways to supply places and things that you just don't think can be supplied. So he immediately realizes that he's got to figure out another way into Jerusalem. The Israeli forces, they don't have enough forces to break the siege head on. They can't just go with a battering ram and go after the Arab armies who are surrounding Jerusalem. And for those of you who know your ancient history, and for those of you who are fans of Game of Thrones, you have to understand how Jerusalem is such an important city. In ancient times, cities usually had one or another defense. They either had walls or they had a mountainous terrain surrounding them. Jerusalem has both. Jerusalem has walls and mountainous terrain. So in ancient times, in the time of King David especially, it's considered to be an unbeatable, impregnable city. If you read you may notice if you go to shul every week that they never have any good King David stories in any Haftorah. I mean, if you think about the Haftorahs that mention David, he doesn't come off too well. He's kind of an impotent, literally and figuratively, guy on his deathbed in one of the stories, and the rabbis didn't like the kings, including King David, so that's another lecture. But anyway, his great military feat, other than killing Goliath, as a general, is he figures out how is he going to conquer Jerusalem, and he goes into the sewage area, the rain catching area underneath the walls of the city, kills the one guard there because he knows there's only one, and that's how he gets the forces into Jerusalem, and that is the brilliant capturing of Jerusalem. They totally stole this in one of the episodes of Game of Thrones. That's how they took over one of the cities. They go underneath through the sewage and the water, a system underneath a walled mountainous city. So whatever, that's what's great about the Bible. It's public domain. You can steal stories from there and no one's going to sue you. So anyway, that's another problem with Jerusalem. There's no way, if you surround it, you already have the natural defenses of the walls and the mountainous terrain, and then you've got these Arab armies that are surrounding. So he decides to come up with, he decides like, well, you know what, we're going to have to build another road, which sounds ridiculous. How are they going to build a road? The Arab armies are right there. They can pick off anyone who's working on a road. When you're working on a road, you kind of have to work, look where you're going. You can't just take cover and put a helmet on and cower. You got to work. So he figures out a way to do this mostly at night. They create other kinds of noises in the general area of other things going on so that the Arabs can't hear the work going on. And basically by June 1st, they're able to start getting supplies in. They called this road the Burma Road because there had been a famous situation in World War II where they called it the Burma Road, where they also had to get supplies in. So it became known as the Burma Road. And by June 1st, so it takes 18 days to start getting some supplies in, but the Burma Road really isn't fully open until June 14th. Now understand that the people who are living in Jerusalem at this time are thinking that they're going to die. They don't have any supplies. They're under severe rations. They don't know what to do. Things are really getting bad there. And by the way, this is one of the big reasons why the old city of Jerusalem, where we have the Western Wall, was not taken during the War of Independence. There are a lot of reasons for it, but this is one of the reasons. The Jewish community living in the Jewish quarter in the old city was really wilting under that siege. And they basically made a deal with the Jordanian forces to kind of surrender. And they were relatively unmolested in that surrender. There are a lot of Israelis who still hold a grudge against the ultra-Orthodox community in the Jewish quarter for doing that surrender, but I think it's easier to say, it's easy for us to say that. They were under severe siege and they made their decision. But the rest of the city is under this terrible siege and they don't know what to do. So that's what he creates the situation. And Mickey Marcus, Michael Stone, whatever, he really is it was very fortuitous. He's the guy who had really made his career and was famous for these kinds of strategies, these kinds of ideas to figure this out. Obviously, he's kind of a mountain mover too, but I like to call him the supply chain part of the war. So in these three things that I mentioned, now granted, the war goes on for more really basically than a year. There's an armistice at the end of 1948, but the fighting goes on until 1949. It really isn't over until 1949. But you don't have any good news. You don't have a victory in the war for the Israeli forces unless these early events that I described happen. Unless Ben Gurion gets those Messerschmitts and they're able to attack that Egyptian column, the war is probably over before the end of May. Unless they get some of the trickery like the Davidka mortar, there's no way that the Arab armies are that cowed by the Israeli forces and are start to get very tentative. And unless Mickey Marcus comes up with the Burma Road strategy to supply Jerusalem, then probably the war at best ends with all of Jerusalem under Arab control, and you have, even worse than the original partition plan, an untenable situation where only Tel Aviv, hard up against the Mediterranean coast, totally indefensible, in my opinion, and in most military opinions. That's the best case scenario. So those things have to happen. Mickey Marcus, by the way, in a sad ending to his life, towards a few months after the Burma Road success, was killed by friendly fire. It's still a huge controversy in Israel how it happened. Apparently, one of the sentries there did not know the passcode, and basically he was shot by another Israeli. There are people there who believe conspiracy theories that because Mickey Marcus had created a huge bit of jealousy within there were some Israelis who were in the army who were jealous of him. I think that is a conspiracy theory. I don't think there was any plot to kill him. It's just one of those things in the fog of war that happens. But if you want to understand why it was so important to have somebody like Mickey Marcus, you should take a look at the picture number 9 right now. I'm going to bring it back to an American context right now. I'm giving you a lot of reading material here. Now, this is the opposite of that first book that I was talking about, the first book by Matthias Kunzel, which you can read in one Shabbat. This is a really, really important book. And I think it's really, I would call it essential reading for anyone who really wants to understand quite a bit of American history. This latest book by Ron Chernow, it's already about 3-4 years old. It's called Grant. It's a very, very long book. Every page, I think, is precious. And why am I talking about U.S. Grant right now? Because the reason why I'm talking about it is if you want to understand what it means to be a general in any army, you need to understand why Grant rose to such prominence in the Union Army. The Union Army was filled with politicians, generals who were politicians, generals who would rather pose for their portrait for their post-war Senate campaign, generals who wanted to look handsome, and they didn't fight. And they didn't care, and they wouldn't fight in battles that they thought they might lose because it would be bad for their reputations. I'm telling you right now that even in the United States Army, actually the United States Army is filled with guys like this. There's a lot of politics. To become a general in the US Army and many armies, you got to play a lot of politics. And here's U.S. Grant, who comes from relatively modest means. His father had some success in business, but had all kinds of things going on in his record. We know that he had a problem with alcoholism, although that was very, very exaggerated. U.S. Grant's reputation is one of the most abused unfairly in the history of America. But if you want to understand what someone who just comes in and fights, someone who understands what his job is, you got to understand U.S. Grant and the kind of generals he was up against. So again, I don't think you can understand the value of a Mickey Marcus, someone who basically got things done for the U.S. Army and then got things done for the Israeli Army, how valuable he was. You could have had a ton of generals, Jewish and non-Jewish, who could have volunteered, who looked great in a picture, but it wouldn't have been what Israel needed. And, there was really only one truly great general in American history who was able to play the politics right, because that was really a big part of his job. He actually had to be a politician while he was a general. And that was the next picture. We can go to picture 10. Actually, go to picture 11. Let's go to number 11, if you can. And that's this guy right here, Dwight David Eisenhower, who was, if you know about Dwight David Eisenhower, sorry about the picture there. This is Dwight David Eisenhower talking to the Army Rangers the night before D-Day. And if anyone knows the history of the night before D-Day and Ike's involvement in D-Day, the mountains that had to be moved, he was so good at being a politician. He was able to juggle the French, the Free French. He was able to juggle Montgomery, the British general. He was able to play politics with them so that the war could progress. But he was also someone who got down in the nitty gritty. This is Ike speaking to the Army Rangers the night before D-Day. And I'm telling you, based on all the accounts of the few people who survived in that picture, they didn't say that they didn't leave the quiet part quiet. It was understood and spoken out loud during this meeting that most of you are going to die. I'm saying goodbye to you, and I'm saying thank you to you on behalf of the American people, because it's understood that when you hit the beaches at Omaha Beach, you're not coming back. And this is something that you need to understand. Ike is so incredibly unique in this way. He's someone who played politics, but also did the nitty gritty stuff and also did a lot of the real strategizing and also was willing to take the risk. D-Day was a huge risk. If it goes the other way, the 20th century probably doesn't complete itself. It's pretty bad. So to understand Mickey Marcus was an acolyte. of Ike's and understands all of this kind of stuff. He's the one who gets down on the nitty gritty. It's one of the reasons why he died. He was down with the troops in the trenches there, not literal trenches, but in the tents. And he dies because of this friendly fire mistake and the sentry thing. But that's why he was so valuable, because he was also on the ground and he understood all that stuff. So you really, really can't underestimate how important it was that it was Mickey Marcus. Mickey Marcus, of all people, understands the supply chain issue. And again, he does a lot more things than just the Burma Road. I don't want to leave you with these 3 examples and make you think this is the whole war. But to me, these are the building blocks of the war, the things that made it possible for the victory. Without these 3 things, it doesn't happen. And please feel free to read about more of the battles and more of some of the other things. There's a lot of fascinating stuff. I've certainly had to leave out a lot because we can't do everything. But to me, these are the 3 key ingredients and the 3 key men who really do it. You have the Ben Gurion, who moves the mountains. You have Dayan, who helps with the trickery, and you have Mickey Marcus, who deals with supply chain. All 3 of them play this huge role. And in the early days of the war, really, in the first month, it's really the first month, which it will tell you a lot of things. By the way, for those of you watching the Russia-Ukraine war, the fact that the first month didn't go well for Russia means it's going to be bad for all, for everybody for a long time. The war's not ending anytime soon, sadly. So these kinds of things are a big part of it. And of course, you can read the Stephen Ambrose book that just came up there, D-Day. I highly recommend the Grant book, and then read the first one, the Matthias Kunzel book, because as depressing as the history of the Nazi influence on the Arab world is, it to me gives me a lot of hope, because if we get rid of that influence, that's all we got to do, and we can start doing some good things. And I think we're seeing that now in the UAE. And you can see a great movie about Mickey Marcus starring Kirk Douglas. Here's the picture now, called Cast a Giant Shadow. I highly recommend it. Pretty good movie, by the way. Also starring Frank Sinatra. Heck of a cast. Not bad. Obviously, it's Hollywood in the 60s, early 60s, so they're making up stuff, but it's not bad. It's not that far off from the true story. So I recommend that movie if you can get it on Netflix or Prime or whatever it is. So to me, these are the building blocks, and I think you really get an understanding of this war. And it's nice that there's such an American involvement in it, despite the embargo, despite the official neutrality and all the hardships that the American government made for Israel in getting weapons. But they do allow Mickey Marcus to come in, and they do have allow for funding from the Jewish community to come in and other donors. So there's some good things going on there. So again, read more, but I hope that you pick up at least one of the books that I just recommended, because I don't think you can understand the context of military history in this war without taking a look at that stuff.
Are you up for any questions?
I'll do my best.
Okay. They're usually really tired by 8:30 at night here, but if anyone has a question, you have the ability to unmute yourselves. I'm going to go to gallery view. If you have anyone's waving wildly, I can unmute you, but you can unmute yourselves. You can also put messages in the chat box, like fantastic presentation. Thank you, Steve. By the way, Neil, Ash, and I were already talking about getting that movie for the we're talking about getting that the Cast a Giant Shadow. That's what I was looking for, Neil, for a future movie where we can discuss it afterwards.
That would be a good one. I'm a big fan of Mickey Marcus, and I know I probably butchered his name. When I was younger, when I was in college, a friend of mine who looks just like you, by the way, from New York, we went to West Point just to look around. I just graduated college, and we walked around the cemetery, and there was Marcus's grave. I mean, it was buried in stones. It was like a Schindler's List moment.
Yeah.
And that was like, what, 20 years ago. So, you think about, even probably today, there are people visiting his grave. So one of the things, I read a book about people, some of the things that Israel did to arm itself. And apparently in the US, they sent a guy to the US. I think he had a hotel room in New York or Chicago, I forget where. And they literally bought a bullet factory.
Yeah.
And broke it down to little pieces and sent it as machine parts to Israel.
Yeah, you can visit that bullet factory. It was an underground bullet factory that started.
Avtalyon, I think is. I've been to it.
Yeah.
Underneath the washing machine.
Yep, you can visit it. And they started manufacturing well before the war because they knew they needed ammunition. They did it underground because the British would have arrested them, and I think even you got the death penalty for that. So it's all underground. They had all kinds. It's kind of like you think about some of the places that people hid during the Holocaust. It was kind of ingenious in that way. So they did stuff like that, and yeah, absolutely. That was a big part of the war. I mean, again, to me, that's again part of the supply chain. That predates Mickey Marcus, but supply chain but that's moving mountains. I think I put that in my moving mountains category. Obviously, there's a little bit of blend over. It's kind of par, but that's the moving mountains. The things that there are so many moving mountains examples, and to have an underground bullet factory that would work around the clock that even the other people who weren't working in the factory on that moshav or kibbutz didn't know about. And that's how secret it was. And they thought that everyone was just working in the laundry, So that was pretty exciting.
I also understand Israel tried to purchase a used aircraft carrier, a World War II aircraft carrier, but couldn't figure out how to get it over to the Middle East.
Yeah.
Well, also, it seems that there was an enormous amount of World War II veterans who were Jewish, who volunteered to fly and provide the technical skills Israel didn't have.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, it's one of the things that sometimes brought up by our enemies, that there were Americans who were involved. And the answer is yes, there were individual American Jews who participated, but they were not under the approval of the United States government or the army. Mickey Marcus is one of the few people who got under the table approval. Other people didn't. So it's just, to me, it's a positive. It shows that connection that we have between the United States and Israel. But we really have to understand that in that context, it's silly to say that the United States supported, it was propping up Israel from day one to kill the Arabs. It's just not true.
I never knew the Ayatollah watched the Grand Mufti's thing. That is a real revelation for me. I never appreciated the impact. I mean, I knew about the Grand Mufti, but I never appreciated how much the Arab world drank the Kool-Aid before.
Yeah, no, it's terrible. And it's very, we're seeing this now, this peace, especially with the UAE and in Dubai, it's just incredible. It's a culturally warm peace. It's all the things we didn't have with Egypt or Jordan. They are so happy to see Israelis. They can't wait to talk about the similarities between Islam and Judaism. And, one of the things that really hurt the peace efforts, I think, was the fact that you had huge secularist movements in the Arab and the Jewish world converging at the same time. That thing that really bound us together are similarities of religious life, the daily religious life of a devout Muslim and the daily religious life of a religious or devout Jew. They lost it. So a lot of these Arabs have been led to believe that Jews are all secular. And so when they see yarmulke-wearing, suit-wearing Jews in Dubai insisting on eating kosher food, insisting on not having meetings on Friday night, they respect it so much. And it's so important. And it's so positive. And they're coming to me and saying things like, we pray 5 days a week and 5 times a day. And I said, yes, I knew this. This was suppressed. Some of your people knew this, but a lot of you were not told of this. And it's so important for you to remember this because, you missed out. And we're seeing this again. Again, I always have to preface this by saying, I'm not saying it was Shangri-La and the Jews had it great in all these countries, but they had it pretty good in throughout a lot of this history. Boy, I'd rather be living in Cairo in 1850 than Warsaw. Are you freaking kidding me? Or worse, or some part of some shtetl, or in the Pale of Settlement. I mean, it's not even close. So we can't, if someone says that they'll never get along, it's just not true. They can get along. You just got to get rid of a genocidal philosophy, which is not part of Islam. I'm not whitewashing Islam. It's got a lot of problems. But there's problems that are real, and there's problems that are imported from Europe. And, I'm not using that as an excuse. They have to take responsibility for what they've done. They can't just say the Europeans gave it to us. But that is where some of this poison started to, take root in the Muslim world. And we got to get rid of it. And I think we are. There's a Holocaust museum in Bahrain now. I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, this is important stuff, really important stuff. So we can't forget that. And I try to be very optimistic about it because we've seen the pessimism for 70 years and it doesn't work.
One other comment on that. When I was younger, I went to Pakistan with my father. He businessed over there. And my father met with the head of their export promotion agency right after Entebbe. And the guy was just like, only you Jews could do this. And I think there's tremendous respect in the Arab world for Israel.
Yeah.
I mean, do you agree on that?
No, absolutely. And it's because of, there's a certain type of Arab who understands that this anti-Israel stuff, this anti-Jewish stuff has been used as an excuse for their failed dictators and governments, and the fact that otherwise they need to explain to their people why they don't have the basic things that other people have. Now, it's hard. I think that there are a lot of Americans who fall for this kind of divisive stuff all the time. I mean, divisive rhetoric works in politics, sadly, because it keeps your eye off the ball, helps you. I mean, you can't say one good thing about one person who's in government without the person saying, well, you're just saying that because you support him partisan-wise. I make a point of pointing to people from both parties and saying, here's what worked. In our current gun violence situation, we had a Democrat president and a Republican president back to back who reduced gun violence with similar but different policies by such a radical amount in this country that you'd have to be blind not to see it. But when you're interested in hatred, you are blind. But Bill Clinton and George W. Bush got so much gun crime reduced in this country that it was unbelievable. And now we refuse to go back to either one of their policies because we'd rather blame somebody and get the political points off it. That's why this stuff keeps happening. And it just really, really frustrates me. It's not like a pie in the sky solution. It actually worked. It worked for 16 years. Remember, they both had 2 terms. 16 years of massive crime reduction and gun reduction. So the same thing in the Middle East. Things have worked in the past. They've worked together. Between 1880 and 1929, there was massive cooperation between Arabs and Jews in what is now the land of Israel. Then the Muslim Brotherhood, aided by the Nazis, decided to create this idea that we should take it all. We should kill the Jews, get rid of them, and this is our land. Even though there's hardly any Jew or Arab in Israel who can trace their history in that land before 1880. Almost everyone is a newcomer there. So, but that's not the narrative that people want to hear. That's not the narrative that people who need to create these lies and get armies and terrorists to do what they do. We just have to start rejecting that. And a big part of it is on our shoulders, for us Jews to come around and say, well, we can't deal with these people. We really shouldn't be saying that.
Does anybody else have any questions? All righty. I really appreciate all the time you spent with us today, Jake. I'm really looking forward to the Suez crisis. I learned an incredible amount. I feel like a novice, so I'm excited to hear about the Suez crisis. Same time next Monday, and make sure you have the Pirate shirt on, okay, or at least the Steelers shirt.
I'll have something on. This is actually a Columbia University shirt, and I went there as an undergrad. My connection to the school is very much about the football team. The rest of the school I'm not so hot for. I love the football players, and who one of our up and coming players is? He was a freshman last year and got a lot of playing time, but he's going to be a starter this year. Is a young man named Mason Tomlin, and he is Mike Tomlin's son, and he's a good player. And I'm looking at the Steelers' schedule, and I'm hoping that the Harvard game, Coach Tomlin, because they have a bye week that week, I'm hoping that Coach Tomlin will be at that game because he was at a game last year as well. Unfortunately, it was a road game, but I'm hoping he comes to the Harvard game. So I'm all for Steelers connections these days.
I hear you.
Very
Although
much, Jake.
You're
I
welcome.
have to
Really
say, go
good.
Quakers.
Well, thank you very much. It is